This is the first of 3 videos which are going to be devoted to Friedrich Nietzsche's great systematic work, The Genealogy of Morals. It's divided into 3 different essays, so I'm going to shoot one video for each one of the essays. And this is one of my favorite works of Nietzsche, in part because it is, like I just said, systematic. So if you want to get a good handle on what Nietzsche is saying as a philosopher with something like a coherent system, he is an anti-systematic philosopher and he attacks many other people's systems, but he does have a system of his own, then the genealogy is one of the places that you would want to go to. You see a lot of the same themes that he's approaching in other works like, The Antichrist, Twilight of the Idols, Beyond Good and Evil, Thus Spoke Zarathustra, all tied in together, but in a, like I said, systematic way where the different concepts are being related to each other, and he's showing how they flow out of each other or are connected with each other. The other systematic work that, would be, of course, the Birth of Tragedy, but that's an early work. So here we're seeing the mature Nietzsche grappling with one of the really important concepts, the nature of goodness, the nature of value in Nietzschean morals and metaphysics. And it's very important, like I said too in the Birth of Tragedy lectures, to remember that for Nietzsche, epistemology, or the theory of knowledge, metaphysics, the study of what's most real, morals, good and evil, good and bad, and aesthetics, beautiful, ugly, base, noble, all these sort of things are rolled into one. They're not neatly discernible from each other and distinguishable from each other, the way that somebody like, say, Kant would try to make them, or many other modern philosophers have as well. So you notice that I'm beginning with this question here, and this is what he's starting from in the first essay, or the first chapter of this. Where did our conception of goodness, of good as a value, come from? That's really the central idea motivating the entire work, and it's a kind of trick question, because one of the things you're going to see Nietzsche doing in this is saying, well, there's more than one conception of good. There's multiple conceptions of good, and we want to trace out how they actually came to be and how they are in conflict, and which one we actually ought to prefer or pick or guide ourselves by. And also which one is predominant in our modern, actually for us, late modern Western culture. You notice also I have 3 different columns here that we're beginning with. And the reason I did this is because Nietzsche begins by criticizing some other views and putting forth his own view in contrast to them. So I think this is a very useful place to start. There's also some things that aren't on the board, some other views that he's not criticizing quite as much explicitly here, because he considers those views to be so fundamentally mistaken. And Nietzsche is actually paying a compliment to these 2 different groups, the English psychologists and the philosophers like Herbert Spencer. Herbert Spencer, by the way, somebody who you're probably not going to run across in too many philosophical contexts, because he was a very important philosopher in the mid-19th century. He was an English guy who was very influenced by utilitarianism and also by evolutionary thought. Not necessarily Darwinian thought as such, because remember there are many different notions of evolution floating around out there at the time, but this whole notion of development, this whole notion of things taking place historically through a bunch of little different steps that would ultimately lead to a larger kind of jump or result. So, Nietzsche starts out by saying that these English psychologists were onto something. He says, these English psychologists, whom one has also to thank for the only attempts hitherto to arrive at a history of the origin of morality, they themselves are no easy riddle. I confess that as living riddles, they even possess one essential advantage over the books. They are interesting. Now that's a very big compliment for Nietzsche. And for him to say that they're a riddle means that they also don't fully understand what their own project is. They think things are a lot more straightforward than they actually are. And he says, one always discovers them voluntarily or involuntarily at the same task, namely at dragging the parties entieuses of our inner world, our shameful parts of our inner world into the foreground, and seeking the truly effective and directing agent. So these are people who want to know what's really motivating us, what's really making us do the things that we do. All these great, beautiful ideals that we have, like nobility and charity and the Christian way of life, and all these sort of things that people talk about and give lip service to, what's really going on with them? What's really happening in their psyche? What's really at the root of this? So, you know, Freud is coming later than Nietzsche, but Freud would also sort of fit into that, wouldn't he? So these English psychologists are saying things like, well, where did this notion of goodness come from? Well, it came from what was useful for, say, the group or other people, and then you would get some sort of, you know, good response from them, good in the sense that you liked it. You notice we're already starting to use good in fairly equivocal ways. That's something Nietzsche's going to pick up on here. Equivocal meaning ambiguous, multiple ways. But their basic idea is that, you know, we start out as pretty selfish creatures, self-centered, and we gradually become civilized by having other people, you know, show disapproval of our actions when we're self-centered and showing approval of our actions when we benefit them. And so if we make ourselves useful, we get seen as good. We see other people who get rewards for being good. And then eventually down the line, we somehow forget this and we come up with this notion of goodness by itself. And by the time that we get to the present, we're not really sure what it is. But where things really had their origin was just in serving the group or serving other people. You know who else would actually fit the bill for this would be John Stuart Mill. If you read Utilitarianism and you read some of his other works, he lays out a kind of history or a genealogy, a historical account of where something came from, like that. So Nietzsche says, here's what I like about these guys. They are trying to find the shameful part of our inner world, bring it into the foreground, seek the truly effective and directing agent, that which has been decisive in its evolution, in just that place where the intellectual pride of man would least desire to find it. Like, you know, habit, or forgetfulness, or a blind and chance mechanic hooking together of ideas, all these sorts of things. What is it really that always drives these psychologists in just this direction, he asks. So he's asking about their own motivation. He says, is it a secret, malicious, vulgar, perhaps self-deceiving instinct for belittling man? Is that what these guys are about? Or possibly a pessimistic suspicion, the mistrustfulness of disappointed idealists grown spiteful and gloomy? And you notice, Nietzsche actually thinks this is better than an idealist way of looking at things where, you know, things like true beauty exist out there by itself and there's perhaps a good in itself that motivates us or anything along those lines. So he says, a petty subterranean hostility and rancor, perhaps, towards Christianity and Plato, that has perhaps not even crossed the threshold of consciousness. Or is it maybe a lascivious taste for the grotesque, the painfully paradoxical, the questionable and absurd in existence? Or finally, something of each of them. A little vulgarity, a little gloominess, a little anti-Christianity, a little itching and need for space. Nietzsche doesn't actually give us an answer for any of these. He says, we don't actually need to know. But you notice that, keep this in mind, these people are actually going to exemplify a kind of ressentiment carried to the second degree, a ressentiment against the people who show ressentiment when we get to that concept. Now he says, all respect then for the good spirits that may rule in these historians of morality, but it is unhappily certain that the historical spirit itself is lacking in them, that precisely all the good spirits of history itself have left them in the lurch. What does he mean by that? He goes on and he says, as is the hallowed custom with philosophers, the thinking of all of them is by nature unhistorical. So they're coming up with some sort of historical account, meaning that there's development, there's change over time, there's several different periods in which things are taking place. but is it really based in history? What does it mean for something to be based in history? That's something else you want to think about. Does it mean that you just go to a book and you find it there, Julius Caesar crossed the Rubicon, therefore, anything about the Rubicon and Caesar is automatically historical? Well, history has to be based on some sort of foundation, some sort of witnessing, or at least some digging into things and acquiring an understanding of how things developed and where they changed and why they went this way instead of this way at this juncture. You might say that history is a study of the processes of human wills in action through time. And so Nietzsche says these guys are really not historical. Their genealogy is bungled from the beginning. And he says, here's the big problem. How would this forgetting take place? And he says Herbert Spencer actually got this more correct. He at least understood that if you're going to say that the reason why actions became seen as good and certain character traits became seen as good, certain social arrangements became seen as good, is because they worked out better for the community as a whole, that's not the sort of thing that people actually forget. That's the sort of thing that actually gets reinforced and brought to light, and people say, hey, do this because that's good for the rest of us. So Nietzsche says Spencer at least got that sort of stuff right. There's another problem with this too. And here we start seeing Nietzsche's own ideas coming to light. He says, it's plain to me, now we're going to see Nietzsche give his own view. First of all, that in all this theory, the source of the concept good has been sought and established in the wrong place. What's the wrong place? The useful. Useful for another person. The judgment good did not originate with those to whom goodness has been shown, Nietzsche says. And that makes sense. If you think about this way in which these things would have to take place, in order for me to have a sense of something as being good, I would do something good to I would do something to another person which would benefit them, which would make their situation better, which would have a certain usefulness for them, and then they would approve of it, they would reward me, and I would say, aha, now I know what's good. But why would I care about approval or reward? Wouldn't I already have to have the notion of goodness in order to care about their approval or their reward? That's a problem that they didn't deal with. Nietzsche is actually not going to make that criticism. He's going to say, look, that's not even the way it happened. He says, it was the good themselves, that is to say, the noble, powerful, high station and high-minded, who felt and established themselves and their actions as good. That is of the first rank, in contradistinction to all the low-minded, common, and plebeian. So good in that valuation is what is noble, and it's the noble people who actually assert that. And they say, we are the good. Those people over there who are making our shoes and bringing in the harvest and carrying our weapons and putting up with all of our stuff, they are the common, they are the bad. We establish ourselves, they have to sort of suck it up and allow that to be imposed on them. Or they can rise up if they want. They can be good if they want, but then they actually have to take arms and resist. And since they don't, they're bad. So he says, it was out of this pathos of distance that they first seized the right to create values. Grasping the concept of good and saying, this is good, is, in Nietzsche's words, a creation of values, a creation of valuation itself. And he says, what did this have to do with utility? It didn't have anything to do with utility. The viewpoint of utility is as remote and inappropriate as it possibly could be in the face of such a burning eruption of the highest rank-ordering, rank-defining value judgments. For here, feeling has attained the antithesis of that low degree of warmth which any calculating prudence, any calculus of utility presupposes. So he's rejecting this notion of utility as itself being kind of a low, common, plebeian way of looking at things. That's kind of important. What that means is these kinds of understandings are actually going to be representative of a later kind, not an original kind of valuation, and not an original kind of saying this is good. So, how are we going to determine this? What can be our clues? If we're not going to have some sort of, imagined plausible historical account like the English psychologists do, or Herbert Spencer, or pick whoever else you like, how are we going to get at this? How can we work our way back to this moment? Well, it's important to remember where Nietzsche came from originally, academically. Nietzsche was what we call a philologist. And to be a philologist at that time, really even today, it's still a kind of discipline where you have to know a lot of different things, not just the one thing that you're studying. A philologist is officially concerned with words and their origins and determining what the meanings of them are. And philologists are usually concerned with ancient languages, languages that are no longer in process of growth, of fluctuation, and which we have literary monuments for. We also have other monuments as well. We're finding more and more and more through archaeology. Nietzsche was a classical philologist. So that meant that he was studying Greek, Latin, but they had other things at their resources too. This is the time when they were starting to figure out, that there was a sort of a primitive Indo-European language that, Greek, Latin, Sanskrit, Persian, the Celtic languages, all these, were tracing their roots back to German as well, the Germanic languages. The Germans actually called this Indo-German because they're, Germans, but now we call it Indo-European or Proto-Indo-European. And along with the language goes a way of looking at the world and a way of life. So when language changes, or when language makes distinctions, distinctions are being made within a world, somebody like Nietzsche would say. And also people, later philosophers who are working off of Nietzsche. So Nietzsche says, the signpost to the right road for me was the question, what was the real etymological significance of the designations for good coined in the various languages? I found, he says, they all led back to the same place. This distinction between good as noble, bad as common. That everywhere noble, aristocratic in the social sense is the basic concept from which good is the sense of with aristocratic soul, noble, with a soul of a high order, with a privileged soul necessarily developed. So the very notion of having a beautiful or good or worthwhile or valuable soul is something that is developing out of the experience of nobility, of their way of life. And it's counterposed to common, plebeian, low, which are finally transformed into the concept bad. And he uses some German examples. He talks about schlecht, which is a word for bad, which is identical with schlicht, plain or simple, and he gives you a lot of derivations of this. And he says, with regard to a moral genealogy, this seems to me to be a fundamental insight, that it has been arrived at so late as the fault of the retarding influence exercised by the democratic prejudice in the modern world towards all questions of origin. What is this democratic prejudice he's talking about? Well, people are interested in figuring out what the origins of things are, but basically just so they can tear down aristocratic idols, aristocratic obstacles to a kind of democratization of things. So he says, with respect to our problem, if we go back to this, it is of no small interest to ascertain that through these words and roots which designate good, there frequently still shines the most important nuance by virtue of which the noble felt themselves to be men of a higher rank. So what's going on? I'm actually going to do a little bit of erasing now, because we're going to need this board for making sense out of what Nietzsche is actually saying. Goodness is not coming on the scene because one person is useful for another one, and then they look to that person and they say, ah, you're so good, you're so useful, we really love you, you're what we want to be like, you're what we're going to idolize. That would be, in some sense, reactive. Instead, the good are the noble, and the noble give the valuation of good to the noble, bad to the common or base. And you can see this in Greek, kalos, aischros, the noble, the base, or kakos is versus the agathos. And Nietzsche traces this through a number of other languages, and he says they also do it by a typical character trait. There's two kinds of superiority here for the good or the noble. There is a superiority in power, but there's also a superiority in soul. So they actually hold power, and by means of this power they impose their will, they impose this valuation. But they also do this by expressing that they have a different kind of character than the base. They call themselves, and this is a very important point, the truthful. He says, this is so above all of the Greek nobility whose mouthpiece is theogenes. The root of the word coined for this, esthlos, signifies one who is, one who possesses reality. In a certain sense, the nobles are saying, we possess being to a higher degree. We are more than you are. Not just we're greater than you, not just, we're all human beings, but we happen to possess a greater value. They're saying we are something that has more being than you and your way of life. So I'm going to skip ahead a little bit. He does a lot of etymology here. And he says, to this rule that a concept denoting political superiority always resolves itself into a concept denoting superiority of soul, it is not necessarily an exception, although it provides occasions for exceptions, when the highest caste is at the same time the priestly caste. And here he's introducing a really important concept and valuation that he's going to talk more about in section 2, which we'll look at in the next video. He says, when you have a priestly caste, if that caste is on top, so you might think, for instance, about the Brahmin class being above the Kshatriya class in post-conquest India, right? He says, then another valuation between the pure and the impure, the good or the pure, and the impure or the bad. So we have the noble, and now we're talking about the noble priest class. They impose another valuation, good as being the pure, bad or evil as being the impure, the holy and the unholy. And Nietzsche says, look, at first, this is not really about holiness in any sort of transcendental sense. This means pure and impure in, he says, the pure one is from the beginning merely a man who washes himself, who forbids himself certain foods that produce skin ailments, who does not sleep with the dirty women of the lower strata, who has an aversion to blood. No more, hardly more. On the other hand, to be sure, it's clear from the whole nature of an essentially priestly aristocracy, remember we're still talking about aristocracy here, why antithetical valuations could in precisely this instance soon become dangerous, deepened, sharpened, and internalized. So already here, what we're going to call a transvaluation of values is beginning to take place. And it's not taking place by what Nietzsche is going to call the slave revolt of morality. It's taking place within the noble class itself. A portion of that class is imposing a new sort of valuation. And how do the priests do this? He says, there's from the very first something unhealthy in such priestly aristocracies and in the habits ruling them, which turn them away from action and alternate between brooding and emotional explosions, habits which seem to have as their almost invariable consequence that almost intestinal morbidity and neurasthenia, which has afflicted priests at all times. But as to that which they themselves devise as a remedy for this morbidity, must one not assert that it has ultimately proved itself 100 times more dangerous in its effects than the sickness it was intended to cure? The priest is, in a certain sense, a person who is set apart, and they're set apart because they are different from the noble, ruling, warrior, kingly class, who are healthy, able to impose their will on others. The priest is less able to do that, but the priest compensates by finding something greater, or at least seeming to be greater. The priest opens up the possibility for the first time of what we might call a transcendent dimension. And he says, he criticizes what he calls the entire anti-sensualist metaphysics of the priests. The priests are the ones, not the philosophers originally, the priests are the ones who start talking about a world beyond this world, a reality underlying this reality. And he says, he talks about the auto-hypnosis, they sort of fool themselves, the only too comprehensible satiety with all of this, together with the radical cure for it, nothingness or God. For the priest, everything becomes more dangerous. Not only cures and remedies, but also arrogance, revenge, acuteness, prolificacy, love, lust to rule, virtue, disease. The priestly class adds a deeper dimension to human existence. It really only becomes truly human with the advent of that, because it only becomes historical in any meaningful sense, I think, for Nietzsche, with this transformation. So he says, it's only fair to add that it was on the soil of this essentially dangerous form of human existence, the priestly form, that man first became an interesting animal. That only here did the human soul in a higher sense acquire depth and become evil. And these are two basic respects in which man has hitherto been superior to other beasts, having depth and having the possibility of evil. So, let's skip ahead a little bit. Now he's going to start talking about ressentiment, and now he's actually going to carry out a shift that's a little bit ambiguous here in this part, and we want to try to keep things as distinct as possible. He starts talking about the priestly mode of valuation and how it's different from the knightly aristocratic one, and how it can develop into its opposite, especially when the priest and the warrior are in jealous opposition to each other. He says, the priests are the most evil enemies. Why? Because they're the most impotent. That's kind of paradoxical, so let's say that one more time. The priests are the most evil enemies, but why? Because they're the most impotent. It's because of their impotence, he says, their inability to actually take on the warrior class and push them down and fight them on their own terms. And also, inability to get the warrior class to recognize, that the priests actually, maybe know more or can do more in certain respects. He says it's because of their impotence that in them hatred grows to monstrous and uncanny proportions, to the most spiritual and poisonous kind of hatred. That's a really important point. When you have depth, that depth can be filled by love, that depth can be filled by admiration, or that depth can be filled by hatred. And the priest can hate to a degree, to an extent, that's really impossible for the warrior, because the warrior doesn't have that depth of soul, even though they are, among the great class or things like that. And he says, human history would be altogether too stupid a thing without the spirit that the impotent have introduced into it. So what is this spirit? He talks about spiritual revenge. And now we're going to see the common, or what he also calls the slave, introduce a new set of valuations into morality. Now, he's talking very much about Jews in this. And you want to be very careful in understanding this. Nietzsche got associated with anti-Semitism and sort of a particularly virulent, racist, German-centered anti-Semitism that ultimately led to the Holocaust and the death camps and World War II in general, you know, the whole National Socialist movement. It's a little bit unfair to push Nietzsche automatically into that if you actually read this carefully. In part because he's going to see the culmination of Judaism actually in Christianity, first off. So Christianity is going to absorb this development that's taking place in Judaism. And he's also going by other people's conceptions in ancient times of what was happening in Judaism. So he talks about a priestly people. And the reason why he's talking about the Jews in particular is they sort of embody the both priestly preoccupation and this sort of emphasis on the slave. So he says, this alone was appropriate to a priestly people, the people embodying the most deeply repressed priestly vengefulness. It was the Jews who, with awe-inspiring consistency, so he's saying they did something that was unparalleled in history. They dared to invert the aristocratic value equation, good equals noble equals powerful equals beauty equals happy equals beloved of God, and to hang on to this inversion with their teeth, saying the wretched alone are the good, the poor, impotent, lowly alone are the good. The suffering, deprived, sick, ugly alone are pious, alone are blessed by God. Blessedness is for them alone, and you, the powerful and noble, are on the contrary the evil, the cruel, the lustful, the insatiable, the godless to all eternity, and you shall be in all eternity the unblessed, accursed, and the damned. And he says one knows who inherited this Jewish revaluation. What does he mean there? He means Christ. Christ is actually sort of embodying this valuation. And it's very interesting to think about this. If you read the Old Testament, particularly if you read, things like the book of Judges or some of the books of the prophets, are you really going to get the sense of what Nietzsche is talking about here, that in every single case it's always the powerless, the weak, who are good, who are beloved by God, and the powerful are always bad, wicked, the rich are always terrible. No, you're not actually going to get that conception. And also, even if you read the Psalms, yes, the pious, faithful, good-acting, reliable person who is lowly is beloved by God, but so is the prince. In the New Testament, if you read it a certain way, there's this complete revaluation. If you push it in the direction of you should always be, totally meek, humble, absorb any insults that are thrown your way, pray for your enemies, then you would get to something like what Nietzsche is talking about. And in this revaluation with the common or slave morality, it becomes no longer a matter of good on top of evil. It becomes good, or good on top of bad. It becomes the noble person is the evil person, and then the commoner is defined as good by not being noble, by being their opposite, by being not evil. So whereas with the noble valuation, the good person asserts their goodness and then defines the others as bad in contradistinction to them, it's the evil that's defined first, and then the good only follows from that as a sort of shadow of it in the revaluation that's taking place in what Nietzsche calls slave morality. So he says, how did this happen? And he says, one should not imagine it grew up as the denial of that thirst for revenge. No, the reverse is true. Love like the love that you see in the New Testament, grew out of it as its crown, as its triumphant crown, spreading itself farther and farther into the purest brightness and sunlight, driven as it were into the domain of light and the heights in pursuit of the goals of that hatred. What are the goals of that hatred? Well, to dominate. In every single case, each one of these things is an expression of somebody's will. Somebody's will to rule, somebody's will to dominate. The weak can only rule, can only dominate by subjugating the strong. And the only way that they can subjugate the strong is by transvaluing the valuation that the strong have and sort of catching them in a net of morality, a net of making them out to be no longer the good but instead the evil. And what Nietzsche is saying is that in the New Testament and all these sort of, works that are coming out of this, it's not really love that is driving this. So he's attacking a Christian idea at its very root, that God is love, that Christianity is fundamentally about love, and saying, no, what really fundamentally orients it is actually hatred, revenge, and the lust to dominate. Pretty interesting to think about. It's, in many respects, Nietzsche is kind of like a shadow Augustine, a inversion of Augustine and his, recognition that, yes, there is this lust to dominate in all of us, and we have to somehow bring it under control, otherwise love can't actually come through. And we always have to be suspicious of it. So, now he says, why are you talking about nobler ideals? Let's stick to the fact. The people of one, or the slaves, or the mob, or the herd, or whatever you like to call them. If this has happened through the Jews, very well. In that case, no people ever had a more world historical mission. The masters have been disposed of. And again, you can see that Nietzsche, if you want to accuse him of anti-Semitism, it's an anti-Semitism that is not really like rooted in his heart and his thought. It's rather more or less saying, well, I mean, the Jews happen to be the people that this took place through, but this kind of development is taking place, and it happened. It just happened, more with them. But it happens in any culture where the common start to become the ones who dominate. The masters have been disposed of. The morality of the common man is won. And he says the redemption of the human race from the masters is going forward. Everything is being visibly Judaized, but then he says Christianized, mobized, and then he says, what do the words matter? So it's not a racial thing that he's thinking about here. It's a dynamic of development. It's essentially a political and cultural thing that he's focusing on. And he asks something really interesting. He says, does the church today still have any necessary role to play? Does it still have the right to exist? Or could one do without it? And he says, this is very interesting, it seems to hinder rather than hasten this process. So organized religion, which people think of Nietzsche as being, one of the greatest enemies of, he actually seems to think, at least here, that organized religion tends to hold back this process. Why? Because at least with organized religion you can have some of this stuff going on rather than just a slave morality. Now, we get to a crucial point here in section 10. The slave revolt in morality begins, and here he introduces this concept of ressentiment. So now I need to do a bit more erasure again. Because now we have a key idea that we need to think through. And what is ressentiment? You can transpose it in English and say resentment, but it's not just resentment. There's a whole dynamic that's taking place. So ressentiment first off, it's a product of two things. A desire for revenge and impotence to carry it out. So it's when people desire to hurt, to retaliate, but they're unable to do so. When they've been pushed down and they can't push back up, that they start to undergo ressentiment. And he says, the ressentiment of natures that are denied the true reaction. What is the true reaction? Deeds. And compensate themselves with an imaginary revenge. So that's another key thing. There's a compensation with imaginary revenge. And it doesn't always have to be imaginary just in the sense of like, in your head. It can be taking revenge in other ways later on. Putting somebody in jail, tearing them down, destroying their reputation. Those could all be, or writing a book about them and saying, these people are such, terrible people. Nowadays it could take place through videotaping them, I suppose. Now, like he says, slave morality is not an affirmation of itself. How does it develop? It's from the outset. It says no to what is outside, to what is different, what is not itself, and this no is its creative deed. So, ressentiment is a great big no to things. It's not affirmative. It's only affirming through denying. It's only defining itself by taking the other and making the other evil and then making itself good in response. So like he says, in order to exist, slave morality always first needs a hostile external world. Its action is fundamentally reaction. Now, he talks more about the noble thing. I'm going to skip over this and get back to ressentiment. So he says, while the noble man lives in trust and openness with himself, the man of ressentiment is neither upright, nor naive, nor honest and straightforward with himself. His soul squints. His spirit loves hiding places, secret paths and back doors. Everything covert entices him as his world, his security, his refreshment. He understands how to keep silent, how not to forget, how to wait, how to be provisionally self-deprecating and humble. A race of such men of ressentiment is bound to become, eventually, cleverer than any noble race. It will also honor cleverness to a far greater degree. So he says, the noble person, by contrast, can't take one's enemies, accidents, or one's misdeeds seriously for very long. That's a sign of strong, full natures in whom there's an excess of the power to form, to mold, to recuperate, and to forget. Such a man shakes off with a single shrug many vermin that eat deep into others. Here alone, Nietzsche says, is genuine love of one's enemies. Love of one's enemies means not really taking notice of what they do to you, because you're so strong that they can't really hurt you anyway. Now, the person of ressentiment doesn't do that. He says that the person of ressentiment brings in the enemy in a very different way for the first time. And he says, I'm going to go on with this. Yeah, here we go. I'm going to come back to the noble in a moment. Where has this left us? Where has this brought us to? He calls it the diminution and leveling of European man, of modern culture. So what is actually taking place with that? Let's go back and talk about the noble a little bit more. He says, the noble, this is easy to understand if you look at things like Homer or other Greek writings and epics, or if you look at other cultures' epics as well. He says, the same men who are held so sternly in check among their equals, by custom, respect, usage, gratitude, and even more by mutual suspicion and jealousy, and who on the other hand in their relations with each other show themselves so resourceful in consideration, self-control, delicacy, loyalty, pride, and friendship. That's what they display to others on their same rank. To the ones who are different than them, they are just like, devastators. They're conquerors. They come in, they're barbarians. But they have culture, at least at their own strata. What does culture mean for us? What does culture mean for Western culture, Western democracy, Western development, all these sorts of things? Nietzsche says, supposing that what at any rate is believed to be the truth really is true, and the meaning of all culture is the reduction of the beast of prey, man, to a tame and civilized animal, a domestic animal, then one would undoubtedly have to regard all those instincts of reaction and ressentiment through whose aid the noble races and their ideals were finally confounded and overthrown as the instruments of culture, as development, as going higher and higher and higher, when really things have been brought lower and lower and lower. So he says, how would we know if that's the case? Have things really been getting better and better and better? As we've democratized, as we've found everybody who's marginalized and brought them into the limelight and made space for them and not allowed them to be bullied or exploited or pick whatever you like by the strong, what has happened? Well, he says something really interesting here. And now we get to another issue that's very closely tied with ressentiment, and that is what we call nihilism. Nietzsche says, what does culture mean to us now? What has culture actually provided us? What has it actually given to us? He says, one may be quite justified in continuing to fear the blonde beast at the core of all noble races and in being on one's guard against it. But who would not 100 times sooner fear, where one can also admire, than not fear, but be permanently condemned to the repellent sight of the ill-constituted, dwarfed, atrophied, and poisoned? And is that not our fate? He's asking this about Western culture in general. Is that not our fate? That we've been condemned to, no longer have nobility present as something that we can look up to. What today constitutes our antipathy to man? For we suffer, he says, from man beyond doubt. Not fear, for rather that we no longer have anything left to fear in man, that the maggot man is swarming in the foreground, that the tame man, the hopelessly mediocre and insipid man, has already learned to feel himself as the goal and the zenith, as the meaning of history, as higher man, that he has indeed a certain right to feel thus, insofar as he feels himself elevated above the surfeit of ill-constituted, sickly, weary, and exhausted people, of which Europe is beginning to stink today, as something at least relatively well constituted, at least still capable of living, at least affirming life. You can see how much self-loathing is involved in this culture, and if we were going to transpose this into today, is our own culture of Nielsen ratings and American Idol and pick whatever other sort of leveling things you like, where we make everything about what a majority of people think, and we turn people essentially just into consumers and voters. Does that actually produce much of great value culturally, Nietzsche would ask us. And he goes on and he says, this is how things are. The diminution and leveling of European man constitutes our greatest danger. Our greatest danger, he says. For the sight of him makes us weary. We can see nothing today that wants to grow greater. We suspect that things will continue to go down, down, to become thinner, more good-natured, more prudent, more comfortable, more mediocre, more indifferent. And here's where he says something interesting. More Chinese, more Christian. So he's tying together this notion of sort of like an imperial China, where everybody knows their place and nobody disturbs anything. And then he's bringing up, sort of cultural Christianity along with this. He says, here precisely is what has become a fatality for Europe. Together with the fear of man, we've also lost our love for him. Nietzsche thinks that genuine love for man is not possible in ressentiment. That, it may posture that way. It may use the words of love to harness people in, to put them down, to deprive the powerful of their power. But it doesn't really love. We have lost our love of him, our reverence for him, our hopes for him, even the will to him. We have lost our capacity to choose something higher. He says, the sight of man now makes us weary. What is nihilism today, if not that, we are weary of man? So he's giving you a definition of nihilism that is not exactly the same as what he talks about in other works, but it's weariness of the human condition as we know it in our culture because of these transformations that have taken place that we didn't quite get. I'm going to skip ahead a little bit. He's got some great stuff discussing Ressentiment, but I want to skip ahead to the section 16, where he's drawing a conclusion. He says, let us conclude the two opposing values. And what he means by values there are systems of values. Good and bad, which is what the noble person evaluates in terms of. Good and evil, which is what the base person, the slave, the common person evaluates in terms of. These two values have been engaged in a fearful struggle on earth for thousands of years. And though the latter value has certainly been on top, what does he mean the latter value? Good and evil, with evil being the noble and good being the person who's, not rocking the boat, the mediocre. That's been on top for a long time. There are still places where the struggle is yet undecided. Now here he's going to say something very important, particularly for anybody who would be attracted to Nietzsche's thought and want to try to think it out. He says, one might say it has risen even higher and thus become more and more profound and spiritual, so that today there is perhaps no more decisive mark of a higher nature, a more spiritual nature, than that of being divided in this sense and a genuine battleground of these opposed values. What that means is that Nietzsche is saying that one of the marks of spiritual profundity in a person is that both of these two valuations are still fighting within that person. He's not saying that the blonde beast, the Superman who totally imposes their will on everybody else and creates new values and all that sort of stuff. He's not saying that is the deepest thing. He's saying that really we ought to feel this tension, this conflict, not just outside of us in the culture where we say, oh, I'm going to go this way or I'm going to go this way, but going right down the middle of our very being. That we can't extricate ourselves so easily from this situation. We ought to feel torn between these two different valuations. So he says the symbol of this struggle, and now he's going to give us a little bit of history, is Rome against Judea, Judea against Rome. There has hitherto been no greater event than this struggle, this question, this deadly contradiction. Rome felt the Jew to be something like anti-nature itself. The Jew stood convicted of hatred for the whole human race, according to the Romans. How, on the other hand, did the Jews feel about Rome? 1,000 signs tells us, but it suffices to recall the Apocalypse of John, the last book of the Bible, also called the Book of Revelations. If you actually read through that book, it is not a particularly loving book compared to other parts of the New Testament. It's more like, and then those bastards are going to get what's coming to them. It's much more like other apocalyptic books. And if you wanted to pick a book that might exhibit Ressentiment, that might actually be the book for you. I don't think you're going to find that much Ressentiment, say, in Matthew, or in certain letters compared to Book of Revelations. And he says, for the Romans were the strong and noble, and nobody stronger and nobler has ever existed on earth or ever been dreamed of. That's an interesting thing for Nietzsche to say, because, you could have talked about the Mongols, could have talked about other groups, but he took the Romans for that. Every remnant of them, every inscription gives delight if one only divines what it was that was there at work. The Jews, on the contrary, were the priestly nation of Ressentiment par excellence, in which there dwelt an unequaled popular moral genius, he says. One only has to compare similarly gifted nations, like the Chinese or the Germans, with the Jews to see which of them, now this is a really interesting thing, which of them is of the first rank and which of them is the fifth rank. What is Nietzsche saying here? The Jews, when it comes to moral determinations, first rank. The Germans, fifth rank. Which of them won for the present, Rome or Judea? There can be no doubt. Consider to whom one bows down in Rome itself today as if they were the epitome of all the highest values, and not only in Rome but over half the earth. Everywhere that man has become tame or desires to become tame. 3 Jews and 1 Jewess. Jesus of Nazareth, the fisherman Peter, the rug weaver Paul, and the mother of the aforementioned Jesus named Mary. Rome has been defeated beyond a doubt, he says. So he's tracing out a history, again, a genealogy, right, of moral valuation. Then he says, okay, so for a long time, Rome was subjected. In the Renaissance, he says, things started to come back to life. And why did they die out? The Reformation. He says Judea immediately triumphed again thanks to that thoroughly plebeian Ressentiment movement called the Reformation, and to that which was bound to arise from it, restoration of the church. With the French Revolution, now the French Revolution was anti-clerical, right? Anti-religious. Shouldn't that have been maybe a restoration of the noble idea? No, because it was democratic. With the French Revolution, Judea once again triumphed over the classical idea, and this time in an even more profound and decisive sense. The last political noblesse in Europe, that of the French 17th and 18th century, collapsed under the popular instincts of Ressentiment. So Nietzsche is saying Ressentiment was behind the French Revolution as well. Greater rejoicing, more uproarious enthusiasm had never been heard on earth. And then he says, Napoleon, of course, appeared. The most isolated and late-born man there has ever been, and in him the problem of the noble ideal is such made flesh. One may well wonder what kind of problem it is. Napoleon, the synthesis of the inhuman and superhuman. Napoleon sort of imposing his will and values kind of, the way the noble did before, but doing so in the service of an empire and a bureaucracy and a democratized regime, which is that of the revolution. In some more twists and turns that we see going on in this study of the genealogy of morals, Nietzsche is going to examine the history of these developments. He's going to flesh out a little bit better this notion of the priestly caste. He's going to develop this notion of ressentiment, slave morality in greater detail. So that's what we're going to be looking at in the next couple chapters.